I, Harry S. Truman.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon.
I, Jimmy Carter.
I, Ronald Reagan.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
I, William Jefferson Clinton.
I, George Walker Bush.
I, Barack Hussein Obama.
I, Donald John Trump.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully
execute
the office of President of the United States.
Will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution
of the United States.
So help me God.
In the little house where the Pixies are learning to embrace their civic duty, political affairs are discussed daily as we keep abreast of the latest shenanigans of our elected class. And given DC's propensity for the dramatic and the ridiculous, the goings-on inevitably have a way of turning these conversations comedic, leaving us all suspended between laughter and disbelief. Such discussions have always been considered important in our family and home, as it naturally lends itself to the practice of sharpening skills in reasoning, problem-solving, evaluation, comprehension and processing of information, and eventually participating in our American form of government, even if it's simply voting in our political leaders. The process of electing our president and vice president have been set in stone for some time now in these United States, never fluctuating very far off the rails, despite every attempt of the media to assure us that this election is the most desperate of our lifetime and an absolute crisis of democracy, which is, of course, the other guy's fault. All of which brings to mind a classic societal admonition involving a truth-challenged youth and a wolf and the consequences thereof. Nevertheless, our normal consists of a rhythmically dependable 4-year occurrence that divides the nation in opinion and debate for just long enough to drive citizens across the country to the threshold of insanity before a harried populace desperately rushes out to cast their vote, snatching the "I voted" sticker from the fingers of a long-suffering poll worker in euphoric relief as they exit the polls. And that, for no other reason, but so each of us can assure our fellow countrymen that we have completed our civic duty and have bowed out of the arena of bitter discourse for the moment. And when the new guy slaps his victorious hand down on the divine tome, swearing to protect the nation and the Constitution, we all breathe a small sigh of relief that another contentious 4-year tradition in the political realm has come to completion. Kind of. Okay, so not everyone is relieved, and combative behavior centered around differing ideologies will continue to remain in the forefront of the public awareness to some extent, as no self-respecting news person would ever allow the acrimonious fires they've nurtured so carefully to become no more than an ember, lest the public's nervous system have enough time to rest and revive. After all, partisan politics can only thrive where division is stirred into a tasty porridge of grievances and fed to both sides with their choice of biased sweeteners to mask the poison within. And all these clever little tricks have been going on since the establishment of our democratic republic. Almost. There was that one time when the stars aligned and miraculously every member of Congress unanimously agreed. 10 states cast their 69 electoral votes for a retired guy who was just trying to decide what crops he was going to plant on which part of his Virginia estate, and who wanted nothing more than to pick figs from his own trees and rest at the end of the day by stretching his long legs out before a crackling fire laying in his own hearth. None of this was actually happening, however, because this fellow was far too popular for his own good, and people kept dropping by to visit. But a man could dream. The 2 remaining states, out of the current 12 in existence, had found themselves with nothing to say in the matter at all, as they hadn't gotten around to ratifying the new Constitution, and it didn't matter anyway, because literally everyone with a voice was enthusiastically volunteering their friend, who wasn't present when the conversation and decision were reached, for a position he had no desire to fill. But by the spring of 1789, it had become painfully obvious that things were not exactly going to plan for Virginia's favorite son, which is why he found himself, not entirely unexpectedly, at his writing desk setting quill to paper in a letter of acceptance to fill the position of the first president of the United States. And this despite his wife's disapproval of the idea. Martha had been enjoying their home life, finding it a welcome respite after having spent half of the 9 years of the Revolutionary War at the front line with her husband, and the other half at Mount Vernon without him. But she was well aware by this time that being married to a national hero came with sacrifices. After all, he'd already spent the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia as the president of the Constitutional Convention, where he presided over the raucous debates held in the revising of the Articles of Confederation and in hammering out a shiny new central government in sworn secrecy behind the shuttered windows of Independence Hall. Upon completion of his duties, he had inked his distinguished signature to the newly minted Constitution before happily setting off for home, again, where he tried to implement his much longed-for vision of retirement, but his friends had other ideas. Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee and several other equally helpful longtime friends advocated for George Washington being the only individual alive who was ideal personified and who, through his virtuous fame, could unite the tenuously held together states into a solid federation. And it was this, in large part, that was the reason Charles Thompson stood in the general's drawing room on April 14, 1789, awaiting Washington's response to the Senate President pro tempore, John Langdon, who had written to the great man,
I have the honor to transmit to Your Excellency the information of your unanimous election to the office of the President of the United States of America. Suffer me, sir, to indulge the hope that so auspicious a mark of public confidence will meet your approbation and be considered as a sure pledge of the affection and support you are to expect from a free and enlightened people.
George's reply was written in his recognizable neat hand.
I have been long accustomed to entertaining so great a respect for the opinion of my fellow citizens, that the knowledge of their unanimous suffrages, having been given in my favor, scarcely leaves me any option. Whatever may have been my private feelings and sentiments, I believe I cannot give a greater evidence of my sensibility for the honor they have done me than by accepting the appointment. All I can promise is only that which can be accomplished by an honest zeal.
Upon receiving the responding missive from Washington, the jubilant Secretary of Congress hurried back to New York with the precious letter tucked safely within his waistcoat. For his part, George reluctantly set out for New York 2 days later, saying goodbye to his unhappy wife who had found herself too busy packing up their lives once again and that of her 2 young grandchildren that they were raising to make the trip in time to witness her husband's inauguration. The 7-day journey between Mount Vernon and New York, the infant seat of the presidency and capital of the new republic, quickly turned into a magnificent procession as the president-elect, accompanied by a congressional committee, were met with excited crowds of well-wishers, women dressed in white tossing flowers while singing, carefully constructed arches, and a barge that had been specially prepared just for this trip. The vessel, which sported a mast and sail, was draped with red curtains and an awning, and had 13 rowers on either side who were dressed in white uniforms with black caps. As the ship moved up the New York Bay, decorated crafts fell into line behind it, creating a festive maritime parade. In passing by the Staten Island Battery, the president-elect received a 13-gun salute, which directed all the ships to fly their flags. And as the procession approached their destination, a British packet fired another 13-gun salute, which was answered by the American battery, and the Spanish sloop, the Galveston, fired 15 powerful cannons, eliciting huzzas from the men in attendance. Washington's old friend George Clinton and thousands of loudly cheering New Yorkers met him at the foot of Wall Street as he disembarked, before he and his military escort made their way to his new executive home at No. 3 Cherry Street, the largest home available in New York at the time, and which had been rented, remodeled, and refinished by Congress to befit the needs of the first leader of the fledgling nation and the entertaining it would entail. A week later, on the morning of April 30th, the rising of the sun was announced with a military artillery salute fired from Fort George. As the clock chimed 9, the peal of large brass bells reverberated on the crisp morning air throughout New York City, their lusty voices continuing to sing out the dawning of a new day for a solid half hour. A military escort arrived at Franklin House to conduct the president to his destination at precisely noon. His journey would be made with a full procession, including a grand marshal, a 500-man military contingent made up of a troop of horse artillery, and 2 companies of grenadiers. The first of these companies was made up completely of young men from New York, Dressed in smart blue coats with red facings and gold ornamentation, they wore cocked hats adorned with white feathers, along with waistcoats, breeches, and white gaiters. The second was a German company, who also wore blue jackets but with yellow waistcoats and breeches, tall cone-shaped caps faced with bearskins, and black gaiters. A troop of Highlanders dressed in traditional garb marched along, also playing the bagpipes. The man himself was elegantly understated, dressed handsomely in brown bespoke broadcloth suit made from American wool and tailored precisely to his 6'2" frame. His gilt buttons were each engraved with the arms of the United States, and were the only bit of frill he wore. His black-buckled shoes were polished, his white stockings fashionable but unadorned, and his steel-hinted dress sword hung comfortably at his side. He moved with an effortless ease, his naturally commanding military bearing covering his internal concern for the weight that was about to be set upon his shoulders. He was required to tilt his fashionably white-powdered head down slightly as he climbed into the state coach and four, joining his two aides for the trip to Federal Hall. Those who observed him were filled with a sense of both awe and anticipation for the future of the country. Making up the rest of the contingent was the Senate Committee, a committee of the House, the Chancellor of New York, Robert Livingston, the French and Spanish ministers, and a multitude of eager citizens. In front of the expensively and elaborately restored New York City Hall, turned Federal Hall, two military units were drawn up, one on either side of the street, providing an avenue for the presidential contingency to proceed through on their way to the Senate chamber, in which Congress was awaiting their arrival, and John Adams, newly elected Vice President and President of the Senate, formally welcomed him, the President-elect, into the distinguished body. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, General George Washington stepped out onto the brightly decorated balcony of Federal Hall that overlooked Broad Street, and beneath the red and white canopy, in front of a densely packed sea of people waiting with bated breath below, placed his sun-browned hand on a Bible borrowed at the last minute from St. John's Masonic Lodge and held by the Chancellor who would administer the first oath of the office of the President. He breathed in, and belying the nervousness that swirled through his mind and body, spoke with strong, seemingly unruffled sincerity.
I, George Washington, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States. I will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
The dignified man then leaned forward and placed a reverent kiss on the Bible, and immediately Robert Livingston, Chancellor of New York and member of the Committee of Five, who had drafted the Declaration of Independence which had led to this moment, turned to the crowd and yelled,
"Long live George Washington, President of the United States!"
The crowd below roared as the first executive humbly bowed to them and placed his hand over his heart, then turning, left the balcony, heading back to the Senate chamber, where in a soft and obviously nervous voice, he delivered his first inaugural address, his demeanor steadfast and modest throughout it. Following the address, the entire company made their way to St. Paul's Chapel, where the Episcopal Bishop of New York led the celebration of divine service, offering sacraments, prayer, and scripture to the esteemed congregants. Finally, as the evening approached, George found himself dining alone in his residence, a few moments of peace in which he could reflect on the day's events and the expectation of the future. But only for a short time, as the darkening skies soon reverberated with the booms of mortars as fireworks filled the sky and intricate illuminations lit the capital city in celebration. The President joined his friends, first at the Chancellor Livingston's home, and then General Henry Knox, to enjoy the pleasant company and watch the displays. As the night came to a close, so densely crowded were the streets that by the time the small group headed home, they ended up having to abandon their coach and walk the rest of the way to number 3. It would be almost a month before his wife and family would arrive and fill the executive home with the familiar and comforting sounds of life that would strengthen his resolve throughout the tough 8 years he would serve setting the standards for the office of the President of the United States. And then, once again, he would attempt to retire to his beloved Mount Vernon. Those of us in the little house find ourselves in complete agreement with Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee concerning the fact that perhaps no man alive in this founding era commanded the admiration and respect so unanimously as to be able to give the brand new nation a solid footing of unity. By handing in his resignation as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, leaving the field of battle with no demands, no pay, no promised award, to become a private citizen without assurance of a prize, was perhaps the single most example of greatness and selflessness that the watching world had seen to date. It was much discussed in awe by world leaders, newspapers, and among citizenry, as the man who stood at the top of the nation's victory gave it all up, willingly returning to private life as a farmer. It was this that convinced his peers that he was the only right choice for the newly formed executive office, a man of supreme discipline and easy authority, who simply had no desire to be a king. Lighthorse summed it all up beautifully in his famous eulogy to Washington, delivered a mere 2 years and 9 months later. He was
first in war, first in peace, and the first in the hearts of his countrymen. He was second to none in the humble, endearing scene of private life, poised, just, humane, dignified, and commanding. His example was edifying to all around him, as were the effects of that example lasting.
We hope you enjoyed today's video that peeked into the first inauguration to get a glimpse of a great statesman who quite literally gave his all in the service of his country. Please consider liking the video, commenting on it, sharing it with your friends and family, and even subscribing if you haven't already, as it all helps our channel continue to grow. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.